A very warm welcome to our viewers today. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. And I'm pleased to say that today's program is co-sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and by the Department of Sociology's Critical Race Initiative. I'd like to remind everyone who's joined us today that today's program is being recorded. And of course, I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair, for organizing today's event. A lot goes into this event and these sorts of events, and she's always in the background doing the hard work. And so I greatly appreciate all that she's done to make this possible. And of course, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Martha Jones with us today, whom I will introduce to you in a very brief moment. But first, to tell you about the annual lecture that the Bahá'í Chair holds every year. So usually we hold the annual lecture during the fall semester, and the purpose of the lecture is to re-inaugurate our commitment to academic excellence, scholarly insight, and intellectual development. We accomplish this by inviting a distinguished scholar to share with us, a scholar whose understanding and whose outstanding efforts touch upon the chair's central purpose. That is the pursuit of truthful insights that will lead to a more just and a more peaceful world. The Bahá'í Chair advances its purposes through an intensive learning process focused on 5 themes. They are structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, the empowerment of women, the challenges of global governance, the caretaking of the environment and climate crisis, understanding human nature. Of course, as you can imagine, today's lecture touches on 2 of these themes, structural racism and the root causes of prejudice, and the empowerment of women. Professor Jones's scholarly work directs us to remember the paths that led us to the present and to recommit to a broader, deeper vision of the future. Her efforts demonstrate the equality and that equality and democracy are not the creation of impersonal forces, but are the product of protest, agitation, and public and private commitment. By connecting us to the culturally rich traditions of activism among Black women, Dr. Martha Jones reminds us that the best recipes for future success often abide in the living present and in the forgotten past. So it's really my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Martha Jones. She is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. It has been selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books in 2020. Her 2018 book, entitled Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, was winner of 4 awards: Organization of American Historians Liberty Legal Award. It was the best book in civil rights history by that organization. The American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize, the best book in American legal history. and the American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award, in this case, the best book in Anglo-American legal history, and the Baltimore City Historical Society Scholars Honor for 2020. Professor Jones is also author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and a co-editor to Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Of course, these are her books. She has hundreds of articles and essays, which are too many to share with you today. Professor Jones is also a public historian writing for broader audiences. The New York Times, Washington Post, Chronicle of Higher Ed, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, Talking Points Memo, Political. And she is an exhibition curator for Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation at the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan, and an expert consultant for museum, film, and video production with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, and ART, which is a European cultural TV channel. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the City University of New York, which bestowed upon her the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa in 2019. Prior to her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City, recognized for her work as Charles H. Repson Fellow on the Future of the City of New York at Columbia University. She is an immediate past co-president of the Berkshire Women Historians, and today serves on boards of Society of American Historians, the National Women's History Museum, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, the Johns Hopkins University Press, and the Journal of African American History, Slavery, and Abolition. It's with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Martha Jones. Please, Professor.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahmoudi. Thank you also to Kate Seaman. It's an honor to be here under the auspices of the Baha'i Chair, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity and the space you all are providing for me and for folks who are tuned in today to think together about some of the challenges that we pointedly face as a democracy in the United States, but also the ways in which perhaps history is one instrument, history is one tool, one lens through which we can think not only about that past, but as you put it, also to think about that future. And as you all have heard, I am a historian of American democracy, which means most days that my principal task is to explain how democracy has changed over time, where it began, the road it has taken. My work is to discover how we arrived here in 2022. We might say this latest chapter in that story. My approach is to tell that story by placing Black Americans at the center of American democracy. A great deal has been written, of course, about how people of African descent have shaped this nation, have shaped its political culture. Some say we are the canaries in the coal mine, the place where signs of how our democracy is unwell, uninhabitable, how it puts all Americans at risk is told in the story of Black Americans. At the same time, I think Black Americans are standard bearers, those who not only pick up the ideals upon which the nation has rested. Black Americans are those who hold the high bar when it comes to democracy and challenge the nation to live up to its best and professed ideals. Black Americans are also, at the same time, forever foreigners in a domestic sense, borrowing that phrase from historian May Nye. Black Americans continue in many quarters to be outsiders in the face of persistent and permanent, for some, anti-Black racism. This is a stress and a strain on a nation that does not have the capacity to excise the color line from the body politic. In this view, America is a white man's country, and what W.E.B. Du Bois termed double consciousness permits Black Americans to see American democracy as both insiders and outsiders. Now, sometimes I'm asked to draw upon the past to anticipate the future. And it often goes something like this. What are the lessons from the past that might aid us today as we face this latest chapter in the American struggle over and about democracy? And I confess that for a long time, this was a question that I sidestepped. I politely declined it. I believed that historians were best at explaining what came before, looking in that rearview mirror, assessing how the nation traveled from point A to point B, from the Revolution to the Civil War, from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement, from 1619 to 2022. Our data is drawn from an archive that is not wholly of our making, from artifacts conserved from the past that give us an important sense of how to reconstruct and explain it. But we have no crystal balls, no special means of anticipating the future. We don't construct models exactly or systems. We don't aim to produce them even. Instead, human history is profoundly contingent, changeable, unfolding within specific and shifting contexts. The past does not determine the future. In some sense, the future is always ours to make, at least from the historian's point of view. So when this democracy, as is true today, when this democracy shows clear signs of strain, when it appears to be challenged by forces that are, well, anti-democratic, as a historian, I might aid our deliberations by charting how we got here, and that's fine enough. But when I hear today that old question, the one I long avoided, what can the past teach us about the present and the future? It has become a compelling challenge. Can't we please take lessons from the past? Isn't there a way in which understanding how we got here might help guide us forward? Black Americans have fought for democracy's best ideals. Can't their story lead us through our own difficult chapter? I have really taken to heart the urgency of those questions like never before. And I imagine that's true also for some of you. So I have carefully tried to answer them. I'm sure that the lessons from the past are not ones about how to win or even about winning. Despite the popularity of the oft-quoted adage, history is written by the winners, when we tell the story of Black Americans and democracy, it is sometimes a story of those who prevailed, those who effected change, those who saw their ideals realized. But it is just as often a story about disappointment, about defeat, and beginning efforts that will only be realized another day and in another generation. So I want to tread lightly here. I recognize that what comes next rubs up against adages that some of us have grown up with. They function as a sort of civic creed. Many of us subscribe to them. But I'm afraid it's not enough to say, as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. did when he echoed abolitionist Theodore Parker and adopted the metaphor of the arc, as in the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And while it may be inspiring rhetoric when President Barack Obama borrowed from the US Constitution to describe ours as a nation on the path to a more perfect union, he pressed many of us onward, but he was not as true to the historical record as we might wish. History promises us nothing. So the title of my talk today, Democracy is Debate, is meant to convey my sense that it might be useful in this time to reframe our thinking about democracy as less about winning ideals or achieving goals or affecting progress. Though I am deeply invested in those aims, my purpose today is to encourage us to understand democracy not as a win-lose proposition, not as progress versus stagnation, not as backlash or the return of a regrettable past. Instead, I want to underscore how I see democracy, how I see this democracy is characterized by debate, an ongoing, perennial, long, and arduous debate about those fundamental ideals that have so consumed African-American politics and hence the politics of the nation. Democracy in this sense does not encompass or necessarily get us to the realization of our best ideals. It's important to say. Democracy does not ensure justice, at least not as Black Americans have defined it through terms like self-determination, equality, and dignity. Democracy in the American way is at its best, at its most potent, a process. It is a coming together, a convening. It is the possibility that we will gather, that we will exchange ideas, that we will discover a varied sense of that which is ethical, even that which is moral. Democracy is the means by which we return again and again to core principles, enduring symbols, to beleaguered but sweeping ideals. Democracy does not promise precisely how our deliberations will turn out, not in any generation. Instead, democracy promises that there will be a table, that we will return to that table, and in our own time, in our own context, grapple with the very fabric of who we are. So we discover democracy, I think, when we step into the forum, into the agora, into the Athenaeum. And for Black Americans, the hush arbor, the hall of the 19th century's colored conventions, the chapels of historically Black colleges, juke joints, the Gulfside Chautauqua, the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the barbershop and hair salon, in petitions and newspapers and paint and plaster. There we listen for the debate, the exchange of ideas, and we hear democracy at work, as John Dewey understood it, democracy as a practice. It is a debate in motion, in real time, fraught, rowdy, but it is also learned from the hip. It is lofty, it is in the trenches, it is eloquent, and it is raw. It soars toward our best ideals and is mired sometimes in deep despair. Across all of this nation's past as a nearly 250-year-old nation, debate rather than progress has best characterized American democracy. Rather than fall back on adages about our journeys as circular or being destined to repeat the past or even as backlash, we can discover contests over the character of the body politic that have challenged every generation. History strongly suggests that our distinct tradition and indeed our future will include much more of the same. The fabric of democracy is stitched together by our disagreement. In my work, that means the study of citizenship, of voting rights, of who is in and who is out, who has a claim to a place in this vast and contested geography. Democracy is constructed in politics, its practice, rituals, real-time access to the levers of power, voting rights, as we'll talk about today. Finally, American democracy is enacted through symbols, icons that we all recognize, even when we don't agree about their meaning. And with that, I want to turn to the story of Black women's struggles for American democracy, and in particular, the right to vote. And what I expect, though I'll welcome your questions and your comments, is that there is a great deal in the story I will tell today about a prior century, an earlier history that resonates powerfully and maybe even unsettlingly with our own time and in our own struggles. So in 2020, many of you will know, the US marked the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. This is the so-called Women's Suffrage Amendment. And while there was a great deal to celebrate, I was not one that engaged in much of that. Because when we appreciate what an open secret Black women's disenfranchisement was in 1920, the facts of the 19th Amendment, I think, fit very awkwardly with 21st century events that featured light shows and period costumes and marching bands. In the 19th, in the coming of the 19th Amendment, members of Congress who promulgated the amendment, the state lawmakers who ratified it and made it part of the Constitution, and many of the suffragists themselves who promoted it, all understood that nothing in the 19th Amendment, nothing in its terms would prohibit individual states from strategically using things like poll taxes and literacy tests, understanding tests, to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in the new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and the violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. Voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand more than 100 years ago in 1920. I want to go back and talk about what happened in that summer of 1920. Two, I think, myths predominate and surround that moment, and perhaps you've encountered them. The first goes something like, when the 19th Amendment became law, all American women won the vote. Maybe you've sometimes even heard that women were guaranteed the vote by the 19th Amendment. But there's a second myth, and that almost runs contrary or counter to the first. And it goes something like, no Black American women gained the vote in 1920, that racism kept Black women from the polls. So part of my work has been to confront and challenge those myths. But let me remind you first what happens in August of 1920, and then we'll talk about them. The US Secretary of State certifies the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. It's ratified by 36 states. And I can read the text, the principal text of the amendment, because it's very brief. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Surely now laws that reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution. They were unenforceable. But still, the 19th Amendment did not promise, as you heard, American women the vote. Still laws, state level laws, kept women from the polls based on their age, their citizenship, their residency, mental competence. In 1920, it was still true that women in the US who married foreign nationals were denaturalized. They lost their citizenship and hence their right to vote. So when women showed up in the fall of 1920 to register, they confronted many sorts of hurdles, even if sex was no longer one of them. There was, of course, one additional barrier to women's votes that persisted even after the federal amendment, and that was racism. It was true that 50 years before, in 1870, the 15th Amendment had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race. But by 1920, especially in the American South, lawmakers set hurdles in place that had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Those poll taxes and literacy tests, grandfather clauses, effectively kept Black men from casting ballots. That had started in the 1890s. Along with unchecked intimidation, the threat of lynching, the deal was sealed. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line that ran counter to the 15th Amendment. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African-American women in too many states became, in a sense, equals to their fathers, their husbands, their sons. State laws disenfranchise them now in an end run around the spirit of the 15th and the 19th Amendments. And when we recover as best we can, registration numbers for those early election cycles, we see the effect of those discriminatory laws. In the fall of 1920, Black women presented themselves to voting officials, but many found that, how can I put it, the books were closed. At the same time, though, the first waves of Black women voters had been unleashed even before 1920 in some states. In California in 1911, Illinois in 1913, New York in 1917. In those states, Black women were already experienced voters by 1920. And the federal amendment only brought more of those women to the polls to register and cast ballots in the wake of the 19th Amendment. So how did women manage to do that? Black women managed to do that in 1920. It required more than a federal amendment. It required organizing. One example comes from the city of St. Louis in Missouri, where Black women organized under the auspices of a local YWCA, the Phyllis Wheatley branch, named for the 18th century enslaved poet. There at the Phyllis Wheatley Y, Black women ran suffrage schools and prepared themselves and one another for their chance to register. They taught one another how to pay a poll tax, how to pass a literacy test, even when it was administered by a begrudging official. They turned out on registration days, and newspapers reported that in the fall of 1920 in the city of St. Louis, nearly every woman in the city registered that season, Black and white. And still, Black and white women in St. Louis only partially share a purpose when they look to register to vote. It was true for all women that this was a moment to, if you will, fulfill the promise of American democracy by formally joining the body politic. It was a symbol of women's struggle, certainly, but their advent into the mainstream of American politics. And this symbolic aspect of the 19th Amendment in the fall of 1920 was shared by Black and white women alike in St. Louis. But it was true for Black women that there was also another purpose. And what they knew was that the city of St. Louis was already in the process of enacting in local law a housing segregation regime that was drawing stark and devastating lines between neighborhoods, limiting where Black Americans could live, where they could aspire to live in the city, limiting, constraining their access and their proximity to municipal resources and more. And the city is using voter referenda to put these new laws into place. So when Black women register and vote in St. Louis in 1920, they are, yes, responding to this possibility for all American women vis-a-vis the body politic. And at the same time, they are responding to this nascent civil rights activism that is gaining toehold in St. Louis. This perspective on voting rights, this approach to voting rights, this purpose for voting rights that today we term intersectional was very much a part of Black women's thinking about the meaning of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Another example, one that has really guided so much of my work comes from Daytona, Florida, and the example of Mary McLeod Bethune. Mrs. Bethune's likeness has just been unveiled in the National Statuary Collection in the Capitol. She now represents the state of Florida, having displaced a long standing statue of a Confederate general. But in 1920, Mrs. Bethune was not yet a national symbol or even a symbol for the state of Florida. Mrs. Bethune was an educator, the founder of what is today Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona. She was a leader in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and she was a suffragist who traveled the state of Florida in 1920, organizing Black women, not unlike the organizing that went on in St. Louis, organizing Black women, getting them prepared to register and to vote that fall. Mrs. Bethune is confronted by brutal opposition each and every step along the way. Florida, in a period rife with racist and anti-democratic violence, Florida stands out as one of the most violent settings for Black Americans who looked to exercise voting rights. Mrs. Bethune is confronted by this personally, collectively. And on Election Day Eve in Daytona, white-robed Ku Klux Klansmen march downtown and then out to the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's girls' school, aiming to intimidate her, her students, her faculty, and more broadly, the Black women of Daytona. The Klan is looking to keep them from the polls. They don't prevail in 1920, and Mrs. Bethune and the Black women of Daytona will come out collectively, use the modest but important safety in numbers that their numbers might bring to register to vote. But by 1922, the violence will persist and have persisted so much so that Mrs. Bethune is among those women who will withdraw, Black American women who will withdraw from the direct struggle for voting rights. It is simply too dangerous. So when Black women later in the fall of 1920 look back and assess the first season, if you will, of the 19th Amendment, they look out over a profoundly varied landscape. Places such as St. Louis, where Black women have begun to vote for the first time, but cities like Daytona and states like Florida, where they have been largely kept from the polls. And the question is what to do going forward. Some of the responsibility for that falls on the shoulders of Ohio's Hallie Quinn Brown, also an educator, a suffragist, president in 1920 of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And Hallie Quinn Brown recognizes the limitations of the 19th Amendment, recognizes how state laws, intimidation, and violence are undermining at least the spirit of the 19th Amendment, the best spirit of the 19th Amendment, and she needs to devise a plan. And her proposal is that the NACW now organize to win federal legislation, legislation that would give teeth to the 19th Amendment and permit Black women to push back against, to set aside, and to override what is happening on the state and local level, all that is keeping them from the polls. She needs a strategy, and she is an admirer of women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, and the success of their campaign for the 19th Amendment. Hallie Quinn Brown is not naive, and she understands how Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and others had abandoned Black women in the quest for the 19th Amendment. But she wonders if it isn't possible now with their success. She wonders if now Black and white American women might link arms and see through the promise of the 19th Amendment and look to win that federal legislation. She knows that these are women who not only understand politics, they understand how to turn its wheels. And a delegation of women from the NACW will call on Alice Paul in the winter of 1921 and call on Paul very specifically to join them in now a new chapter in the struggle for women's voting rights, one that would win that federal legislation and get Black American women finally to the polls across the board. And while we don't know precisely what was said in those meetings in February of 1921, we do know what happens in the wake of that meeting, and that is that Alice Paul will begin to fold up the National Women's Party, and shortly thereafter become a champion of a new federal amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, an amendment that is still in our own time awkwardly, haltingly making its way toward ratification. Alice Paul moves on from voting rights and leaves Hallie Quinn Brown and Black American women more generally to devise their own approach to a next chapter in the struggle for voting rights. Some of this story, I think you'll know, the story that takes us from the disappointments of 1920 to the ultimate success in 1965 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. But it is not a given as Hallie Quinn Brown looks out across the nation's political landscape. How do we get there? It requires, on the one hand, requires Black women to remain in the trenches of voting rights each and every election cycle, much as the women in St. Louis and Daytona, Florida had done. They register when they can, they cast ballots as they can, they use their political power collectively, voting as a bloc in an effort to move the needle on election day, particularly in local contests. The best example here comes out of Chicago and the organizing work of the great journalist and suffragist Ida B. Wells. In Chicago, Black women have been voting since 1913. They have become Republican Party operatives in these years. They are present in the precincts, and they are organizing themselves to use the vote collectively, and they will have some important success. By 1928, sending Oscar DePriest to Congress from Chicago, the first Black American to be elected to Congress since the advent of disenfranchisement at the end of the 19th century. So Black women are in the trenches and doing the work day in, day out of voting rights as they can. They are also part of an important legal campaign, largely steered by the NAACP and later its Legal Defense Fund. This legal campaign will use the US Constitution to chip away at some of those Jim Crow strictures that are keeping Black women and men from the polls. They will defeat grandfather clauses. They will defeat whites-only primaries. They will successfully win a constitutional amendment that defeated the poll tax. So this legal campaign has its beginnings even before 1920 and will, of course, culminate in the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But there's a third part to this story, and I think probably certainly the most consequential, and that is the advent of the modern civil rights revolution. By the 1940s, Black women are going to be the architects and the organizers and the foot soldiers of the modern civil rights movement, looking to, in a sense, hold the feet of the nation, of members of Congress, of the president, and more, hold the nation's feet to the fire of their insistence upon Black voting rights. And we know that those mass movements rooted in nonviolent resistance are indeed the efforts that turn the tide and bring both Congress and Lyndon Johnson around to the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This is the realization in 1965 of Hallie Quinn Brown's vision, federal legislation that would give teeth to the promises of both the 15th and the 19th Amendment. And with it comes the advent of a new chapter in the era of Black voting rights. One of the questions I often get is about what has changed. And I think perhaps you're hearing echoes of our own time, or echoes of this past time in the stories of our own time and much more recent election cycles. And if you do, I think you're right. And still a great deal has changed over the course of a century. And that's where I want to leave us, thinking about the relationship between this past that I've described and the present that we find ourselves in. And perhaps you were like me in the summer of 2020, when during the Democratic National Convention, Senator Kamala Harris took the podium to accept the Democratic Party's nomination. She was going to run for the vice presidency alongside Joe Biden. Well, I tuned in because it was, by, I think, any measure, an historic occasion. And more to the point, however, I wanted to know what then Senator Harris was going to say about how she had arrived in that place and that time, in that moment in the summer of 2020, 100 years after ratification of the 19th Amendment, almost to the day. She was, I was sure, going to have to tell a story for the nation, for the world, about how she, a woman of African and South Asian descent, the child of immigrants, found herself now vying for one of the nation's highest offices. And she didn't disappoint. Partly, if you recall that speech, you'll remember the tribute she paid to her own mother, an immigrant to the United States from India, a medical researcher, a woman who instilled in her two daughters, Kamala and Maya, this sense of their unbounded potential. That certainly is part of the story that Senator Harris told on that evening. She stood, as she said, on the shoulders of her own mother. But she also invoked the names of 6 women, all of whom figure in the story I have shared with you today. And while this is too nice an occasion for me to impose a pop quiz, I will tell you those names and say a little bit about them as a way of concluding. Senator Harris invoked Mary Church Terrell and Mary McLeod Bethune, who I mentioned, Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer, Constance Baker Motley and Shirley Chisholm. Really, to my mind, 3 generations of Black women who bring us from the disappointments of the 19th Amendment in 1920 all the way through to the Voting Rights Act and beyond. Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, a compatriot to the great Ida B. Wells. Terrell, who, despite the anti-Black racism that she confronts, vividly confronts in the major women's suffrage associations of the early 20th century, Terrell is someone who insists on a seat at that table, keeps that place, is clear that Black American women are going to steer their own political futures and not leave them in the hands of white suffragists. Mrs. Bethune, Mary McLeod Bethune, whose stories in early Daytona I've related, but Mrs. Bethune will go on in the face of those disappointments and not sit down or stay home or wait for someone to enact a Voting Rights Act. She moves in part to Washington, D.C., and in the 1930s will befriend both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, so much so that she helps President Roosevelt to assemble what is colloquially remembered as his Black cabinet. Mrs. Bethune learns there is more than one way to exercise and even to wield political power. And she uses her personal relationship to the Roosevelts. She uses federal patronage to bring Black Americans to decision-making posts in Washington, even from states like Florida, where they cannot cast ballots, they cannot be elected to public office. Diane Nash and Fannie Lou Hamer, 2 icons of the Civil Rights Revolution. Nash, who was a behind-the-scenes figure, an architect, a strategist, responsible to an important degree for the Selma campaign that really does bring Congress and Lyndon Johnson to the table around the Voting Rights Act. Nash does not cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge there in Selma. She is behind the scenes, making sure that the paramedics are on hand when those marchers are brutally attacked by state officials in Alabama. Fannie Lou Hamer, the one-time sharecropper turned voting rights organizer, who will, alongside Nash, temporarily, lead the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and challenge that party for its exclusion of Black Mississippians from the state delegation that is going to nominate Lyndon Johnson for the presidency that summer in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Fannie Lou Hamer, hardly a behind-the-scenes person, though she certainly was that. Mrs. Hamer was someone who understood the power of the image, the power of television, of new technologies of communication, and she uses that to bring the battle for voting rights into the living rooms of Americans, in addition to bringing it to the halls of Congress, and helps to turn the tide that gives us the Voting Rights Act. And Constance Baker Motley and Shirley Chisholm, 2 women who really help us appreciate the ways in which the Voting Rights Act in 1965 transforms for Black Americans the prospect of political power. Now, Constance Baker Motley has been a member of that NAACP team doing the litigation that has challenged the Jim Crow strictures against voting rights for Black Americans, but she will go on to be an office holder in her home state of New York, And by 1966, will be appointed the first Black woman to sit on the federal bench, the foremother, if you will, of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson today. Constance Baker Motley really comes to embody what the Voting Rights Act makes possible, as does Shirley Chisholm from Brooklyn, New York, a state office holder, the first Black woman in 1968 elected to Congress, who in 1962 will run for the Democratic nomination for president. Now, I don't think Shirley Chisholm expected she would win the nomination in those years, but her purpose was multifold, and perhaps principally her purpose was to ignite in 1972 that Black electorate that had been empowered by the Voting Rights Act, to show folks the way toward national political power in ways that Black Americans had never experienced it. Among the many, many young people whose lives Shirley Chisholm touches in that campaign is a young woman in Northern California named Barbara Lee, who volunteers for Shirley Chisholm, her first political act in a long life of political activism. And of course, Barbara Lee, who now represents the state of California in Congress. These are the women whose shoulders Kamala Harris told us she stood upon that day in August of 2020 as she accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for vice president. And on the one hand, it is a marker, I think, of how far we have traveled. But as Harris and all of us moved very quickly into that fraught election cycle in the fall of 2020, it turned out that the lessons offered, the lessons exemplified in the work, in the activism, in the vision of these 6 women and so many others was part of what we needed to inform and to sustain us and to take us forward in a tough election cycle and beyond. I think I'll close there if I could, Professor, and say thank you all very much. I very much look forward to questions, comments, discussions. There are many more chapters to this story that I'd love to talk about, and eager for an opportunity to hear how you all think this story, these women offer us lessons, insights, possibilities for how we confront the challenges of democracy in our own moment. So thank you all so very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. We are now requesting that you go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and please write your questions for Dr. Jones to respond to. And I'm going to turn the Q&A over to Dr. Seaman, who will moderate.
Thank you, Professor Mahmoudi. While we wait for some questions from the audience, I am going to start with a question of my own, if that's okay, to give people time to type into the box. So I really liked your description of democracy as an ongoing debate, not necessarily dependent on the ideas of kind of progress or regression. And I'm wondering how this feeds into what you see occurring within US democracy today, and how do we, I suppose, move back to this idea of a debate? We seem to have become so polarized that even having a kind of, I can't think of the right phrase, but a good debate seems more difficult today than it has in the past. So how do you think that factors in?
Yeah. One of the things that I learned from the women of Vanguard, who, as you might imagine, you don't need to imagine, I hope I've begun to describe, are live in a profoundly and work in a profoundly polarized world, and a world that doesn't even pretend to practice a kind of full-blown interracial universal democracy. So how do they do that? And I take my lessons from them. I think it's partly, on the one hand, there is no substitute in an American democracy for being in the trenches in every cycle, right? That so many of the debates that we might have are going to happen very close to the ground, embedded in our communities, in our localities. And we must, as these women do, roll up our sleeves, put on our wellies. I don't know why I'm thinking about wellies this week. I think you do know why I'm thinking about that. It's been so much in the news, but you know what I mean, right? You've got to get into the muck and do the work, right? And that's part of where the debate happens. That's one. When the women in Vanguard get the microphone or the pen, you know, today, I guess it would be the Twitter handle, the Facebook page, they are always certain to speak about ideals. So it is a strategy about, on the one hand, that work in the trenches, which is fraught and messy and eternal. And at the same time, using the opportunities they have to cast that work in broad, idealized terms. And I say that to say that I think we practice democracy today sometimes with the sense that all there is are the trenches and all there is the muck, right? And that there is no place and no space and no role, right, for ideals. And that, I think, is got to be part of our practice, and that will, as it does in some sense, you know, this can feel like speaking into the wind, right? It can feel like you are not being heard. But these are women who understand that their work at democracy is a long game, and that their work will play out over generations. And then importantly, then partly what it means is that they are always preparing next generations. One of the things a lot of these women share is that they have all been educators. And part of their practice is, even as they are actively engaged in their own struggles of their own moment, preparing next generation. So I think that's the third piece, right, is that investment in those who are going to pick up and do the work going forward. These are not women, by and large, who see the Voting Rights Act passed. You know, those women of 1920, but they are preparing the next generations.
Thank you. That actually feeds into one of the first questions from the audience, from Neda Moayed. Thank you for your outstanding research and insights. Please, would you share what currently makes you optimistic regarding Black women's roles, and then also all women's roles in leadership in democracy?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that makes me optimistic are the sheer numbers. I follow Rutgers University, NYU, and the Brennan Center. These are places that are keen on helping us appreciate the way in which Black American women in particular have become a force in American politics. And this is really a first moment for that. You know, yes, Kamala Harris runs for vice president, but there are, I hope I get the number right, I think there are 61 Black women who run for Congress in the fall of 2020. It is a record-shattering number of Black women who run for Congress. And even when President Biden vets women to be his running mate, he looks at 6 Black women. Kamala Harris happens to be the woman he selects, but there is a deep pool of Black women's political leadership from which to draw. This was true again as he came around to look at a first appointment to the US Supreme Court. So these kinds of deep pools of leadership, of experience, of commitment, it is really just coming to the fore. No longer are we in an age of firsts, but we really are in an age of women, Black women as a force in American politics. I think the challenge is, is this nation capable of permitting those same women to lead? There are certainly challenges ahead, but this to me gives me a great deal of hope, because it reminds me, much as the women of earlier generations, Black women in the 21st century are not going home, are not sitting down, are not going to cede even the highest echelons of American political power to anti-democratic thinking and anti-democratic practice.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Stephen Wiafe Amawako. Do you believe racism is the only reason as to why Black women could not vote? In terms of all women, I have heard they were going to have the right to vote. However, they had to join the military to get these rights, and they did not want to join. So are the voting rights for Black women and white women, in terms of access to voting, completely different?
Well, in 1920, they certainly are. There is no threshold for white American women beyond mastering the rudimentaries of registration. There are no requirements of military service or other prerequisites. And white American women will vote, though they will vote very much along the lines of their husbands and fathers, which was one of the criticisms that was leveled at the suffrage movement, that women would not make a difference at the polls, that they would merely mirror and reinforce already existing political positions and divides. But for Black American women, there are structural barriers in law that keep them from voting. They come in the form of what are called grandfather clauses, states that only permit one to register to vote if your grandfather voted before the Civil War, in essence, is what a grandfather clause. Well, that means that any Black American woman, probably most Black American women, and certainly any Black American woman descended from enslaved people, is now disenfranchised, disqualified from registering to vote. Literacy tests, poll taxes are all imposed and organized in a way to keep Black women from the polls. And then, of course, the violence and intimidation that someone like Mary McLeod Bethune confronts is a kind of organized terroristic practice that targets Black Americans, including Black American women. So the answer is yes, that Black and white women stand in very different shoes, at least until 1965. And next time we'll talk about the ways in which voter suppression today continues to visit communities of American women very differently.
Thank you. And I think we would love to have that discussion. So we'll have to have you back. The next question comes from Malik Wilson. Wonderful presentation. How do you balance the needs of the present with the demands of the past, as shown through the recent hubbub in the historical field over charges of presentism? How do you travel the line in your own work?
Thank you for that question. And you might imagine that I have been thinking about that a great deal. And for folks who haven't already tuned in, the president of the American Historical Association just recently published an essay that charged the field, and in particular Black historians, with practicing a kind of presentism, which is a shorthand way of suggesting that our questions, but more importantly, our analyses were driven by the present, our insights about the present, as contrasted with our the archival record of the past. Well, I call BS, as they say, but I want to say why. Because I think what the essay missed is actually part of what's embodied in my talk today. Part of why Black history feels so present is because many of the questions, like the question of voting rights, is not a closed question. It is not a question that we can relegate or situate in the past. When Kamala Harris stands up and invokes these women, it is because their model, their struggles, their questions continue to run through American politics into our own time. And while historians sometimes imagine that human history is reducible to historiographic bits of time, there is, I don't know, there's the progressive era and the interwar years and the Cold War period. That might be convenient as an academic convention, but part of what I learned as a student of African-American women's past is that rarely does the history I write conform to the political slicing and dicing that historians have done over time without consideration of how Black women think about time and think about the continuities of time. So part of what Kamala Harris is telling us in a shorthand way, right, is that the past of an Ida Wells, the past of a Mary McLeod Bethune, the past of a Shirley Chisholm isn't past. It is present. It is embodied in Harris. And I think that is not presentism. That is just a different sense of time and how to understand and explain the past through historical time. Thank you so much for the question.
Absolutely. The next question comes from Michael Penn. Professor, relatedly, some years ago, I read that democracy is a form of government for people who are not sure that they are right. What are your thoughts about such a point of view? Does such a perspective help, or in your view, does democracy require a different orientation toward what is presumed to be right and true?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. And because it taps into something that I've thought about a lot. Because sometimes I get the question, how is it that the women you write about persist, right? In the face of law, violence, intimidation. It's true in 1920, too many Americans really can't even imagine a Black woman voter, no less a Black woman office holder or a Black woman juror. These are really women's, working against the tide. And I think one of the things that keeps them in the game is that they know they're right, that they actually, or they believe they're right. I guess that's the more polite way of putting it. But I think that they believe that democracy, right, healthy, sustained, robust, built for the challenges of a new century and a new century again, that democracy requires a universal, inclusive approach to the body politic, including voting rights. They believe that. Now, I hope that sounds familiar, because in the 21st century, some quarters to the side, I think most Americans would agree race should have no place in arbitrating voting rights. Sex should have no place in arbitrating voting rights and political power. These are women who are ahead of their time and believe that they have a truer vision, right, for an American democracy that is struggling, and they, I think, are sustained by that profound sense that they are right. So thank you. That's a terrific way of thinking about it.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Benjamin Blake. What was the relationship of the Black Women's Vanguard, the labor movement, and voting rights? So the AFL-CIO's Committee on Political Education in the 1950s and 60s, the 1963 March on Washington, and the Voting Rights Act. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because this gives me an opportunity to underscore one facet of how, in fact, this history of Black women and voting rights was for so long overlooked. It was in part because in important numbers, Black women do not join the major suffrage associations. Their politics, their vision for their politics is multifocal, which means you will find within the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs that committee devoted to labor, and that committee devoted to what they would call criminal justice. You would find that committee devoted to suffrage, to civil rights, etc. In other words, the suffrage politics of the major suffrage organizations is too narrow. And so as a consequence, they have been overlooked because they didn't call their organization, women's, they didn't include the word suffrage in the name of the organization. So yes, among these women, you will find labor activists all the way through, but under, and some of them with affiliations, with other affiliations, but doing this work very much as a part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, that really takes this broad, capacious view of the challenges that their own community is confronting, but the way in which American democracy requires thinking on those many fronts. So it's a short answer, but I hope it gives you a glimpse of how, in particular, labor fits in really importantly into their thinking.
Thank you so much. I just want to give it another minute in case anybody else is typing a question up while we wait.
Actually, Kate, may I chime in and ask one question?
Oh, please, Professor Mahmoudi, please.
First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. I think you've given us a very important history of the Black women's struggle in terms of their voting rights. But I can't help but think how much this story also relates to what other things Black women have had to do in this country. And I wondered if you, as a historian, could comment on that, because I think it would be interesting for us in the audience today to see how this also fits into, you mentioned Ida Wells and other women who were really amazing in the things that they took on head on. And so I would just love to hear your impressions of the role of Black women in this country.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question, Professor Mahmoudi, and thank you again to you both for having me. I think that you're so right to remind us that Ida Wells, Mary Church Terrell, many of the nationally recognized Black women suffragists are as, if not more, committed to the cause of anti-lynching in this very same moment. And this goes back to the earlier question. This is why Black women cannot organize and practice their politics in suffrage associations, because Wells has been essential in not only documenting the truth and the pervasiveness of American lynching, she has been singular in championing federal legislation that would override the neglect and the hostility, right, to suppressing lynching that Black Americans were encountering at the state level. And I will say, back to the earlier question, it is Kamala Harris who sees through Ida Wells's project and helps to win federal anti-lynching legislation in the 21st century. It's not past at all, right? It is part of a long story that continues into our time. So these are women with multifold political interests. You know, Ida Wells is an education activist. She's an educator herself, but an education activist on the school board, sitting on the school board in Washington, D.C. in the early 20th century, and grappling with the fact and the legacies of segregation and inequality in public education. These are women who I think have extraordinarily high expectations for the nation, for American democracy, who really set the bar high. And so studying them is an extraordinary lesson in how long it takes the nation as a whole to begin to catch up with their ideas. They are talking about universal voting rights and human rights before the Civil War, at a time where too few folks are tuning in and listening to them. But I think if I picked up on sort of part of the tenor of your question, I think the other thing to say is that this is very arduous, dangerous, and lonely work. There is very little, maybe too little joy in much of this story, and being alone as a constituency to carry the torch for a vision of American democracy without racism and sexism, a vision of American democracy that speaks to dignity as well as equality, a vision of American democracy that speaks to human rights and not only political rights. That is a lonely, lonely quest for most of this story. You know, when I teach this, so many of the ideas, my students find these ideas, I don't know, you know, many of them commonsensical, controversial perhaps, but still commonsensical. And yet for many of the women in the story that I tell, this is a long and oftentimes very, very lonely quest. So I hope that speaks a little bit to your question and maybe what was underneath it.
Thank you. So I think we have time for the last audience question that comes from Tiffany Razavi. Thank you for an eloquent and informative lecture. I appreciate your reframing of democracy as a process, as well as the example you shared to help us think about the historical practice of democracy. As you reflect on those historical experience and the efforts and conviction of Black women, what are your thoughts about how the democratic process can be refined to better promote unity in American society rather than the division and polarization we seem to increasingly confront?
Yeah. It's such an important question, and I'm not going to dodge, but I will say that, you know, I'm part of an institute, the SNF Agora Institute, with colleagues in political science and sociology and fields where this question of the 21st century practice of democracy and how to better practice democracy is really their expertise more than mine. So the best I can offer are these lessons from the past. But I do think that for me, this history, among other things, has taught me to not only claim that seat at the table, to sit down. It's to stay at the table. And I think in some ways in our time, that is among the hardest things of all, that if we stay at the table rather than retreat, we will confront ideas, actions, and more that are anti-democratic and racist and sexist and a great deal more. And partly in writing this book and then going out and talking about it, I found myself in rooms, right, with people who didn't agree. This book was banned in Louisiana because it was deemed too one-sided. And that's, on the one hand, I could say that's just stunning and absurd, and it is. But part of my practice had to be to stay at the table with those folks in Louisiana who were looking in a public library to feature the book as part of a public conversation. I spend a lot of time with K through 12 educators. I'm an educator, so I tend to work in my lane. When Vanguard came out in paperback, which it is out in paperback now, which makes it more accessible, I worked with Basic Books to get it in the hands of educators and to talk with educators about how to incorporate this history into their classrooms. So I think for each of us in our own lanes, the answer might be different. But for me, the core of that is to stay at the table and to not let the banning of a book or the hostility to the ideas and more be the thing that causes me to retreat, and instead trying to be purposeful and creative about, constructing the table, setting the table, convening us. And for me, that work has been very much about other educators and being in solidarity with them as they are on the front lines of a lot of this strife around what is American history and how to teach it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Professor Mahmoudi now to finish us off.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate, for moderating, and thank you, Professor Jones, for answering all those questions. I think it's fascinating to listen to historians who usually say they don't like to talk about the future, but they like that. But you managed to do a little bit of both, and I deeply appreciate that.
Thank you.
Because I know it's not always easy for historians to do that. I was especially cognizant of your comments about how this work that Black women do is lonely and difficult and requires the long haul, if you will. And I think that's a very important lesson for the younger generation of students that we teach, that we interact with, that the cause of bringing about justice and equality is a very difficult and long process, and we have to stay the course for as long as it takes. And having books like yours who educate all of us about the issues and about these brave women who weathered the difficulties and eventually reached some form of wonderful success, that is a very good lesson to all of us. So I am grateful for your lecture, for your excellent work that you do. The things you have told us today really, I think, require us to reflect more seriously about our own role, our own actions in trying to advance these causes, which are all about inclusiveness, equality, and justice. So I truly appreciate your being with us today and for your lecture. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you all so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate the chance to be here.
Thank you. And just before our audience leaves, I'd like to just announce our next event, which is coming up on October 5th. It is featuring Professor Manon Garcia from Freie University in Berlin. And the title of her talk is Experiencing Men's World. She has written a recent book about Simone de Beauvoir's work and basically the role of women in the world, how women come as a sort of a secondary thought into the world. And so Professor Garcia really explores this in a very important manner. And we really do hope that you will join us. It's on October 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it's both online and in person at the University of Maryland, but online for those of you who wish to join us from different locations. We thank you all for joining us today. Again, my gratitude to Professor Jones and to Kate Seaman. We'll see you hopefully on October 5th. Bye-bye.